It's kind of a little microcosm of what is going on in British electoral politics under this very divisive multiculturalism we live in. We've got fractious multi-party politics to fit a frayed multicultural Britain.
I think it's possibly a sign of things to come, that you were going to see that kind of tribal, religio-political mobilization among British Muslims, anti-establishment British Muslims, who pretty much abandoned the Labour Party.
Hello and welcome to the Spiked podcast. I'm Georgina Mumford. I'm here with Spiked's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And we're joined down the line by Spiked columnist Rakib Ehsan. Welcome, Rakib.
Hello.
Obviously, the big story today is the Gorton and Denton by-election. The Greens' Hannah Spencer has been victorious with 41% of the vote share or thereabouts. Labour, who've traditionally held this seat, have not come in second. They've been relegated to third by Reform. Tom, what did you make of these results?
I mean, it's a seismic result, whatever way you look at it. I mean, this seat at the last election, it was one of only about 70 seats, I believe, where Labour actually got above 50% of the vote. It's been Labour under various different constituency boundaries for generations, and yet they've been toppled in the kind of what should have been among the safest of safe Labour seats. I think it was the 38th safest seat that they had in the country. So what you're seeing really in this by-election is the Labour coalition just completely disintegrating. So it's various kind of previous constituent parts, the white working class, so they've obviously been moving away from Labour for some time, in parts of the constituency, also the ethnic minority, particularly the Muslim vote, continuing to go for more explicitly kind of pro-Gaza or pro-grievance politics, if we're being honest, parties in the form of the Greens, and also the younger graduates, the young kind of self-styled progressives, who are clearly seeing the Greens as a more attractive alternative to Labour, or in this seat, a more surefire way of keeping out Reform. So it's a damning indictment of Labour. I mean, Keir Starmer's reverse Midas touch is pretty notorious, but he's really outdone himself, not least because I think many people suspect they would have held on to it if he'd allowed Andy Burnham to have a run at it. But of course, there's also the question of the Greens, which I'm sure we'll get into here, is the nature of this victory, the fact that they did lean into that grievance politics, as I say, and they did it so nakedly and openly. So that raises a lot of questions about what electoral politics is going to look like in sort of fraying multicultural Britain going forward.
Rakib, did you have a similar reaction? Do you think that more identitarian block voting has replaced the more traditional sort of working class solidarity in this area?
Well, there's no doubt, Georgina, that British Muslims have been leaving the Labour Party, their natural party, in their droves. I've often made the point that Israel-Gaza was the straw that broke the camel's back. But there's a great deal of disillusionment within British Muslim communities when it comes to the areas that they live in, which are traditionally Labour-controlled, underperforming public services, there's a shortage of decent, affordable housing, a lack of economic opportunities, and antisocial behaviour as well. I think what was really interesting in looking at this by-election was that before this by-election took place, the Muslim vote actually criticised the Labour Party's decision to block Andy Burnham's application to be a candidate in this by-election. And it encouraged British Muslim voters to opt for the Green Party. Now, we know that the Green Party has a particular brand of radical cultural liberalism, which necessarily doesn't fit in well with conventional Islamic morality. But I think the point here is that it seems like, especially when you look at the campaign material which is disseminated in the build-up to the by-election, much of it actually being in Urdu, which is quite interesting in itself. That there was portrayals of Reform being an anti-Muslim institution, being linked with Islamophobic politics. But there was a real emphasis on punishing the Labour Party, linking Sir Keir Starmer with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the former Foreign Secretary David Lammy. There's an image of him with Benjamin Netanyahu. So I think there's a real effort to tap into the identitarian sensitivities of British Muslims in the constituency. And I think it's possibly a sign of things to come, that you were going to see that kind of tribal, religio-political mobilization among British Muslims, anti-establishment British Muslims, who pretty much abandoned the Labour Party, but might also have concerns over Reform UK, the rise of Reform UK. Well, I think there's food for thought when it comes to the election result for Reform UK. I think that we saw that in the Caerphilly by-election for the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd, where Plaid emerged victorious from there. I think there is a very real threat of that kind of tactical left-wing / progressive voting in order to block Reform UK. Now, if that happens across the country, then Reform could be deprived of many seats. There's no two ways about that. I think that the campaign that they ran, we had Matt Goodwin being the Reform UK candidate in Gorton and Denton. I always felt that Reform were up against it largely because the Green Party had a very effective electoral machine up there. And I think that they really knew how to tap into British Muslim sentiments on domestic and foreign policy issues.
And I suppose sticking with that for a moment, because it is striking the extent to which Hannah Spencer seems to have like ridden Britain's crisis of integration into victory in this particular case. I mean, as you were saying, Rakib, the particular examples of the leaflets and the TikTok videos in Urdu, this is something that really shouldn't pass without comment. I mean, it's been a big controversy of the campaign so far, obviously. But, you know, rather than appealing to voters on a sense of kind of shared interest, shared civic identity, the Greens are not even assuming that their voters speak English. I mean, this is a really alarming development. And essentially, I think it's just saying quite loudly and campaigning quite loudly in a way that was previously done a bit more quietly, particularly by the Labour Party. So this sort of pork barrel identity politics is something that's been practiced for quite some time. Labour in particular over many decades, trying to appeal to certain sections of ethnic minority Britain in relation to faraway conflicts or intra-ethnic tensions, you know, putting pictures of Boris Johnson next to Narendra Modi on flyers and saying, do you trust this man in number 10? That's something that's been going on for quite some time. And the Tories has not completely clean where that's concerned either. But what's striking now is it's so out in the open. I mean, the Green Party made essentially a virtue out of the fact that they're engaging in this pretty murky way of politicking. Zach Plansky openly admitted that he wanted to use kind of anger over Gaza as his way to tap in to the British Muslim enclaves there. So I think this seat is a bit of an unusual one in so many ways. I mean, we'll probably get into the way it kind of breaks down the white working class Denton side and the more diverse Gorton side. But in a way, it's kind of a little microcosm of what is going on in British electoral politics under this very divisive multiculturalism we live in. We've got kind of fractious multi-party politics to fit a kind of frayed multicultural Britain. And as Rakib was saying a little bit earlier, I think this is a sign of things to come and really not in a good way, to be honest.
Yeah, you mentioned this being a microcosm of the UK as a whole. Obviously, you do have Gorton, which has a large Muslim population, Denton, which is largely white working class. Is it that we're going to see Rakib, Reform becoming the definitive party of the white working class and the Greens becoming the go-to progressive, pro-Gaza party, and Labour sort of flip-flopping in the middle?
Well, I think that Labour are really up against it. And I think we have these forthcoming local elections in places like Blackburn with Darwin, Preston, Burnley and Pendle. So in that corner of the country, I think Labour's really up against it because I feel that there's going to be a real surge in British Muslim political mobilisation, and ultimately there's going to be at the expense of the Labour Party. I think just following on Tom's point, this is a very interesting constituency. So if you look at Gorton, there's a high concentration of Asian origin Muslim voters, but primarily of Pakistani origin. There's many voters with that background in areas such as Longsight, which used to be part of the abolished constituency of Manchester Gorton. And then you have Denton, which is overwhelmingly white British, and so the wards in Denton, some of them actually belong to Tameside Council. So it's a very interesting constituency in itself, where I think it's almost like it's a tale of two cities within a constituency. In a sense, and there was obviously a real divergence in terms of political interests. I think in terms of Reform, it's very clear that Reform is going to look to establish itself as the strongest party, the most popular party among the traditional white British working classes. I think in terms of when you look at the British Muslim voters, it appears that they're going to be quite flexible. It depends on what they want to achieve in their particular local area. If they see a party or a particular candidate who is best positioned to defeat the Labour Party, and also with that possibility of blocking reform, if there's a genuine possibility that Reform UK could win in their area, then they're going to go for that option. So they're going to be quite flexible. And I think what you're going to see is an emergence of a sort of left-leaning coalition, in a sense. And I think just moving forwards towards the next general election, of course, a lot could happen before that. But I don't think we can rule out the possibility of a sort of rainbow left-leaning coalition in the House of Commons, which might be supported by the so-called Independence Alliance of MPs, many of them representing constituencies with high proportions of British Muslims. So I think that the UK, its politics is entering uncharted territory. And I think that when you look at British Muslim voters, they're really looking to flex their political muscle in parts of the country where they represent a sizable proportion.
Well, I think the Greens have essentially established themselves now, not simply as the sort of vehicle for progressive anger with the Labour Party, but also essentially as the party of the Islamo-left. I mean, this is something that we've been talking about quite a lot on Spiked in recent months, by which I mean this kind of coalescence in the particular political party of a pretty straightforward attempt to kind of gin up a sense of Islamic sectarian grievance. I don't think that's unfair to say, alongside a supposedly kind of woke progressive agenda. And there's certain areas of overlap. There's certainly certain areas of overlap where Gaza is concerned, but I think it's also something which I could easily see kind of producing some pretty authoritarian proposals going forward. You know, the kind of left's obsession with hate speech mapping perfectly onto the push to criminalise Islamophobia, for instance. I can see that becoming a kind of wedge issue that the Greens or maybe Labour will be tempted to do it a bit themselves in certain constituencies to kind of play up to some of those factors. And I just think it's really quite corrosive for our politics, but it does make perfect sense electorally. That's the thing. Like it's a reality that all the parties have to reckon with, and we can talk until the cows come home about the fact that at the end of the day, Mothin Ali and Hannah Spencer probably don't agree on how many genders there are. That doesn't change the fact that this coalition could be pretty decisive in a lot of places going forward, even though it might break down at some sort of point in the distant future. So yes, it's the rise of the Greens is something. It's certainly not, and this particular election victory is nothing to be sniffed at. Absolutely. I mean, and they clearly pulled off something pretty sizable. It's the first time they've ever won a by-election, and the margin was much larger than anyone expected it to be. But that doesn't mean it. That still doesn't mean it doesn't bode ill, not just for Labour, but I think for our politics more broadly. And
how worried do you think the rest of Britain should be about this kind of Muslim bloc voting? Is it overplayed? Is it just in specific pockets of the UK that we should be thinking about this?
Well, I think it's quite clear that because of the sort of concentration in certain constituencies is something which could easily be much more decisive. And I think it knits too well into the kind of multicultural politicking that the left have been engaged in for some time now anyway. That has sort of encouraged people to vote and to think of themselves not as citizens primarily, but as members of kind of ethno-religious groups who need to be appealed to on those terms. And I think the sort of combination of the fact that that's been going on for some time, plus mass migration, plus the ongoing state multiculturalism, it's just brought it to this point where we could see many future elections just becoming a sort of quite grim demographic headcount in relation to how people vote, which isn't really supposed to be what politics is about. It's supposed to be about, again, a sense of kind of shared interest, kind of sense of previously a class interest. Now that all of that is fracturing, and Labour is just sort of caught in the middle of it, I suppose.
Yeah, it's quite a bleak outlook. Do you agree with that, Rakib?
No, I think that it is a bleak outlook, but I think it's an understandable one. I think that what you're going to see in certain parts of the country is those legacy parties, the establishment parties, always being left by the wayside in a sense. And you'll have your Reform UKs and your Greens, and in local elections also having pro-Gaza independent candidates, candidates representing minor parties such as George Galloway's Workers' Party of Britain. They'll be battling it out in many of those wards. And I think that in certain parts of Northern England, it will essentially be Reform UK versus those kind of pro-Gaza candidates. And it always become those political battlegrounds between those two forces. I think that many people, there's obviously been accusations of family voting where more than one person has entered the booth simultaneously when submitting votes. That's allegations been made by an organisation called Democracy Volunteers, and that's been highlighted by the Reform UK leader Nigel Farage, as well as the Reform UK candidate Matt Goodwin. So I think we also have to talk about the integrity of democratic processes in certain parts of the country. But I think one thing that's very clear here is that if you look at the outcome of the result, the Green Party did perform well. I think it was, as you said, Georgina, it was around 41% of the vote. I think 40.7 to be exact. I think their best performance before that in a by-election was around 10% in Somerset and Frome back in 2023. So it is a remarkable result. And I think that when you look, as I talked about previously, about this sort of left of centre progressive tactical voting, I think that many people feel that we're going to have a Reform UK government, or it might be a Reform UK Conservative coalition. I certainly don't think that we can rule out the possibility of a left of centre coalition where Labour could still be the largest party and still remain in government with the support of other so-called progressive parties and the independent alliance which currently exists in the House of Commons.
No, I think that's probably one of the most underpriced potential outcomes of the next election that not enough people are talking about, because we've seen it in Caerphilly now in terms of a sort of anti-reform vote manifesting itself to a large extent. We've also seen that in Gorton and Denton now, and it does raise interesting questions about reform's trajectory at the moment, because obviously they've been topping hundreds of polls now at this point, but there has been sort of questions about whether or not they're stalling to a certain extent. And one thing that I really noticed when I was in Gorton and Denton last week talking to locals was the kind of enthusiasm gap that existed, at least within that seat, between your sort of reform curious voters who thought, oh, we'll take a chance on this Matt Goodwin fella, he hasn't been in yet, see what he can do. Whereas the kind of reform deranged people who wanted to keep them out at all costs were much more passionate to a certain extent. So I think that's something which, of course, you can't extrapolate from one seat all across the country. And we should say that also Reform put up a very respectable second place here. It came second in the last election, but they were very, very distant from Labour, and they have put down a marker here in a way that could be quite interesting. But it's it raises sort of questions about whether or not they can kind of continue to dominate, or whether or not at the kind of level of vote share that they're at, they can easily fall victim to enough people deciding that on the progressive side, so-called, that their main objective is to keep them out. And just going back to this point about the Reform as the sort of party of the white working class, because as we've already discussed, there is in this particular constituency, the Denton side, overwhelmingly white working class. That was clearly where they were intending to rack up as much vote share as possible. But speaking to Matt Goodwin there last week, it was quite clear that they're also keen to try and peel off certain sections of ethnic minority communities as well. So I think they've kind of got a clear sense that they cannot purely try and max out the white working class vote. There has to be a kind of an attempt to sort of broaden. Otherwise, you might see repeats of what we saw in Gorton and Denton.
And Rakib, where can reform really go from this point?
Well, I think that is something that Tom's alluded to. I think reform will look to be the most popular party among the traditional white British working classes. But I think it's very clear that Nigel Farage is looking to cultivate a kind of robust civic nationalism. And I think you can see that in the kind of appointments that he's made. For example, Zia Youssef is the party spokesman for Home Affairs. Layla Cunningham is the party's candidate for the next London mayoral election. So I think that the interesting thing here was that much of the Green Party's campaigning in Gorton and Denton was ultimately portraying reform as an anti-Muslim institution, linking it with Islamophobic rhetoric. But if you actually look at the parties across the board, we know that Mohsin Ali is the deputy leader of the Greens. But if you actually look at Reform UK, there's a number of Muslims who have very prominent positions within the organisation. So I think that the leadership of Reform UK, I think it understands that it needs to broaden its support beyond the traditional white British working classes and having a more sort of inclusive civic nationalism. And now certain ethnic and religious minorities might relate to that and connect to that a bit better. I think that what was very clear in Gorton and Denton, though, was that there was a general perception among many British Muslim voters that Reform UK was a party that needed to be blocked in terms of winning the election. But maybe there'll be other ethnic and religious minorities. I think maybe British, Indian, Hindus and Sikhs. That could be the kind of ethno-religious groups that Reform UK would be looking to target in terms of winning them over, and maybe more sort of aspirational, upwardly mobile voters of Black African origin. That could be another possibility. But I think the one thing that Reform UK might be somewhat concerned about is that threat of left of centre tactical voting. And it remains to be seen how much of effect that could have nationwide.
Just reflecting, I guess, on how this campaign is rolled out, because it has basically taken the form of both Labour and the Greens just accusing Reform of being essentially crypto-fascist to various points, that they were the far-right party, they were the ones peddling hate, they were the ones peddling division. But looking back over the past couple of weeks, I mean, it takes some really brass neck for them to make that accusation. I mean, you know, Matt Goodwin's slightly controversial comments about being British is not just a matter of a piece of paper pales into insignificance when you see not only many of the openly kind of sectarian campaign that we've been talking about, but also the company that the Green Party have been keeping in recent years. I mean, in the run up to the last election, there's about 20 candidates which were exposed to have made some really vile comments about Israel. I mean, there was one, he was a diversity coordinator standing in Birmingham Perry Bar who praised a pro-Palestine demonstration that disrupted a Holocaust Remembrance Day event at Auschwitz. These are the sorts of people they are attracting because they are leaning in to that kind of politics. Of course, they were all disavowed and what have you, but clearly something is going on there. So when it comes to like who is supposedly dividing society at the moment, or who is actually kind of peddling, or at least in close proximity to some real hate-filled individuals, I think the classic case of kind of projection to say that that's all Reform rather than the progressives and the quite regressive people they tend to be allying themselves with these days.
I'll just make one very quick point. I'll make it very quickly. I think about Matt Goodwin's campaign. I did see one tweet where Matt said that ultimately he's not here for the Muslim vote. He's here to put Gorton and Denton first. And I think that was just a little bit contradictory, because if you're looking to represent a constituency which is 30% Muslim, this is not about putting British Muslims first, but ultimately the British Muslim constituents there, they are part of the constituency. So I think there's just something to think about when Reform competes in more ethnically and religiously diverse areas. How does it strike the right note? And I think looking at its campaign communication and its messaging is something it needs to bear in mind moving into the future.
We are going to be continuing this conversation with Rakib over on the Spiked podcast Unlocked. If you're already a subscriber, you can go there by clicking the link below. If you're not yet a subscriber, you can sign up by going to spiked-online.com/support. That's spiked-online.com/support. We'll see you over there.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back at the same time next week. In the meantime, why not subscribe to Spike's YouTube channel and then click the bell so you're always alerted whenever there's some new content. Spiked is producing more videos than ever, from podcasts like this one to interviews to our series of polemics. You really, really don't want to miss out on it. Plus, to get your daily dose of Spiked, just go to spiked-online.com. That's our website at spiked-online.com.